Good evening, everybody. Welcome to a rainy Monday evening. We have a presentation tonight that we're very excited about. It's called Common Pests and Diseases in the Vegetable Garden with David Leinstein, PhD from Tidewater, AWAC. And if I look out at my tomato plants, they look very sad. So I'm glad we're going to talk about something. This presentation will be about 50 minutes in length with 10 minutes at the end for questions. Please mute your speaker and take yourself off video to prevent any distractions. The chat box will be open for questions for David. One of our co-hosts will collate those questions for David to answer. If you have ideas to share with other participants, please save those for another format. And before you leave the presentation, please complete a very short poll that you'll find to the right of the chat box at the bottom of your screen. The poll will open as soon as we open the form for questions from the chat box. Now a little bit about David Leinstein. David grew up on his family's Century Farm in Gates, North Carolina. He has a BS in agronomy from North Carolina State University, a master's of agriculture and crop sciences also from NC State, and a PhD in plant pathology from Virginia Tech. He spent 16 years as a vegetable plant pathology specialist at the University of Georgia. He was the director of Virginia Tech's Tidewater Research and Extension Center in Suffolk for 6 years and is currently the agronomic crop plant specialist for Virginia Tech. Please welcome David Leinstein.
Thank you very much. I need somebody to stop sharing so I can get my presentation up, but it's good to be here. I'm gonna try to cover a lot of topics during this evening's session, and certainly I'll be happy to answer any questions near the end of the talk. But I've got to be able to share my screen here at some point. But I think is somebody currently sharing a screen?
No, I cut it off.
Let me try again. Here we go. So I hope everybody can see that. That's just my title slide. So I'm gonna, if I can get my presentation to advance here. Trying to, I don't know why it won't advance. There we go. One of the first things I want to talk about is our diagnostic information sheet. We have a clinic at the Tidewater AREC, and there's some other plant disease clinics at some other experiment stations and in the main Blacksburg campus. But what helps us an awful lot when we're trying to diagnose some of these problems is have one of these diagnostic sheet submittal forms completed. And what that does, it answers a lot of the questions that we might have to ask about what you're seeing in your home vegetable garden. So I can't emphasize enough, and this is just general information, how the disease, how the problems look in your garden, what's the distribution of the affected plants. Those type things go a long way in helping us diagnose what's going on. So first I'm going to talk about abiotic plant stresses, and I like talking about these first because these are not diseases. I want to make sure everybody understands what is not a disease first before I get into the diseases. And so abiotic problems are not caused by diseases. Diseases are caused by pathogens. Abiotic stresses are caused by things in the environment, the physical and chemical environment that plants grow in that has a negative impact on plants' growth and development. These are usually, a lot of things are events in time that occur to plants that cause the problems that what you're seeing. I'm going to cover as many of them as I can before we get into the plant disease section. Examples of physical stresses are too much or too little water, compaction in the soil, lower high light conditions, ice, wind, and snow. The chemical stresses are nutrient deficiencies or nutrient toxicities. If your soil pH is too high or too low, salinity problems, air pollution, and pesticides. So as we know, water is really important for plants. It keeps plants turgid, which means it keeps them upright. In other words, if you see a turgid plant is not wilting, turgidity is the opposite of wilting. And water basically is a transport mechanism that takes soil nutrients and other minerals that plants need for growth and development up into the parts of the plant. And it also cools the plant. But too much water can be a bad thing, as you've probably seen. It creates a low oxygen environment in the soil, anaerobic, what we call anaerobic conditions. Sometimes too much water can lower your pH or create acidic conditions, and it can increase ethylene production, which reduces growth and causes wilting. In some cases, can cause defoliation. In some cases, lack or too much of water can cause plants to produce adventitious roots or edema. And I'm going to show you some pictures of that. So here's what adventitious roots look like on a tomato. And it's basically the plant trying to compensate for a waterlogged soil or a soil that's too dry or something wrong with the vascular system. So it tries to put out these roots on above ground plant parts in an attempt to use those roots to reach down and get the soil moisture that it needs if there's something wrong with the root system. And I've seen these on tomatoes off and on in my career that have some sort of problem with the root system either being too wet or too dry. Now, edema typically looks like a wart, plant warts, and these are usually in high water situations. So these are structures on the outside of a tomato stem that are used to compartmentalize water or store water if the plant is taking up too much water. So this is just an attempt by the tomato plant to be able to deal with excess water in the system. Drought stress, this is what we most commonly see is when we don't have enough water. Can be caused by too much heat, low humidity, wind, or just not enough water in the soil. Plants lose water through stomates, and that's the picture of the little stomates there on the right. These open and close different times of the day, and they release oxygen, and they also they release water vapor. And so the more wind and the longer these stomates are open, you lose more water to the air. So plants that are, so if you think about plants that are adapted to desert or very dry conditions, they only open the stomates at night. They have more stomates on the bottom of the leaves. The bottom of the leaves are shaded. They typically don't lose as much water. They either have thick cuticles or they have very straight leaves, and straight leaves, they don't allow for as much surface contact with the air or sun, so they don't tend to cause more water loss as maybe a broad leaf that is more horizontally oriented. So with drought stress, symptoms can appear as wilting. We've all seen wilted plants, but I'm going to show you another symptom called scorching. The longer the plants that are in a water stress, it's harder to reverse that. So if you let plants stay in that wilting condition too long, it's almost impossible to reverse. And sometimes drought stress can be manifested as a nutrient deficiency. Remember, I said soil water is responsible for transport of nutrients up into the plant. If you're not bringing in enough water, if you don't have good enough soil moisture, you're not able to bring those nutrients into the plant where they're needed. So this isn't too hard to figure out. This is a wilted plant. People have seen wilted plants before. When we fill out this on the form, we just check the little wilted box. That gives us a little bit of information on what the plant looks like. And then basically, this is what it looks like to have a loss of turgidity. Turgidity, and this is an eggplant, would be, the leaves would be upright. But in this particular case, they're flaccid and they're flopped over, showing a drought stress symptom. This is the scorching system. The scorching symptom, it looks very different, where the margins of the leaves are they have a burnt necrotic appearance, mostly on the edge or outside part of the leaf. The distal portion of the leaves, the outside leaves, lose water more rapidly than the interior portion of the leaves. So that's what gives you that scorch symptom. So if you were filling out a diagnostic form, you would indicate that some of the plant parts affected are the leaves, and then you might check the little other box down at the bottom. If you don't see a symptom that's what you're seeing, you can call it a dieback, which is typically what we call it a dieback when the leaves are scorched or necrotic towards the tips of the leaves. Blossom end rot on tomatoes is basically a symptom of a water deficiency that causes a calcium deficiency in the fruit. We see this most often when people are not watering their tomato plants on a regular basis, or if they've been allowed to be in a water stress condition too long and they can't move calcium that's in the soil water up into the fruit. So in this particular case, you would mark that the fruit are affected and just a description of the condition that you're seeing in the bottom there, that where they're rotting on the end. It's not truly rotten, it's just cells that weren't able to form because they didn't have enough calcium. Soil compaction is the most common issue related with soil problems that results in inadequate pore space for root growth, especially with clay soils that have a smaller particle size. They have a naturally small pore space, but the result of compaction can make it even worse. They can become severely compacted. If you repetitious traffic in certain areas, you know, if you've seen areas where people drive and there's grass that goes across a path, you'll see where the tires go back, and you can easily see where the tires have traveled. That's compaction that doesn't allow for the grass to grow in those areas. So repetitious traffic, either from a footpath, where animals walk, or from equipment, can cause compaction. And this is typically what you see where people have decided to cut through an area between those boxwoods and on into the lawn. You notice that the grass isn't growing very well, and that's all due to foot traffic that's compacting the soil in that area. For the disease, that the description on the clinic form, you would put that the problem is occurring in spots or in groups, and it's in the landscape. It's in the it's in the lawn. Moving to nutrient deficiencies. Nutrient deficiencies aren't the type of abiotic problem that is caused by an event. So this is more of a gradual, continuous worsening of symptoms. Macronutrients for plants are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They're almost somewhat synonymous with carbohydrates, proteins, and fats for animals. In some cases, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium can also be considered macronutrients. Some of the micronutrients that we'll see as being deficient are molybdenum, copper, zinc, manganese, iron, boron, and to some degree chlorine. And pH affects the availability of all these. So high pHs can affect the availability of certain nutrient ions. Low pH can do it. So a lot of the times when we see nutrient deficiencies, it's the result of a low pH more often than a high pH. And regardless of how much fertilizer you put in the soil, you can't overcome that pH imbalance that's not allowing those nutrients to become available for the plant. So I recommend that for most people that have a garden, to make sure you get a soil test regularly, sometimes annually, to make sure that you have the right, that you know what your soil pH is. You might have to apply lime or some other amendment that raises the soil pH, and have that soil tested by the soil test lab up in Blacksburg. So when we diagnose nutrient deficiencies, I consider them to be two different groups. In the flow chart on the left, the blue, these are the mobile elements. And with mobile elements, you see the symptoms show up in the oldest leaves near the bottom of the plant. And so what happens with these, and this is mostly nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, manganese, and molybdenum, you see the lower part of the plant will start to show chlorosis or yellowing, but the newest growth up near the top of the plant looks perfect. It might be very dark green compared to the lower part of the plant. That's very typical of a mobile element. What happens is these mobile elements are moved from the lower portions of the plant up into the newer growth of the plant, which produces that symptom. With immobile elements, you see the opposite. You see the symptoms show up in the newest leaves. And these are elements such as sulfur, iron, manganese, and calcium that are not moved from the lower, older portions of the plant up into the new portion. So you'll see your symptoms show up in the very newest leaves on those plants. And I'm going to give a couple of examples. If you notice this tree here, and if you look at the lower portions, you see a lot of venal chlorosis. That's yellowing in between the leaf veins in the lower portion of the plant. If you look up towards the top of the plant, the leaves are still dark green, where the nutrient that is deficient has been moved from those oldest leaves that are symptomatic up into the newest growth. And here's the opposite. These are soybeans, where the newest growth, this is an iron deficiency, the newest growth is very yellow or chlorotic, which is a prime example of nutrients that are staying in the oldest foliage and not being moved up into the newest foliage. And in some cases, you can have toxicity. So too much of a nutrient can cause problems. This is an example of a boron toxicity in apple leaves. And so this tree has had too much boron, and it gives a very similar appearance to scorch. So if you see this, but you know you've got adequate water to prevent scorch, you very well may have a boron toxicity situation. How you find that out is you might want to send a tissue sample in to a third-party company or to the lab up in Blacksburg to have that tested. Or in a lot of cases, you can take a soil sample, and that'll tell you if your soil is deficient in or has too much boron. But it's usually when we spray boron on plants is when we see a boron toxicity. Airborne toxins are usually related to an event, something that happens at a certain particular time. So if you notice up at the very top of the clinic form, it's really important for me to know when the date was of the first occurrence of the symptoms, because I'm talking about an event in time that caused them. Or in some cases, it could be a herbicide. So I might want to check the herbicide box down in the lower portion to see if I want to know if there's been a herbicide and what type of herbicide that's been applied anywhere near the plants that are showing symptoms. So in some cases, air pollution can cause problems with plants that we see as symptoms. They're typically from nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, but ozone typically is the most common problem. And it used to be years ago when I started out that if I told somebody, oh, this is ozone injury, they thought that was code for, oh, he doesn't know what it is. They would lump that into the cat. Oh, if he doesn't know what it is, he'll just call it ozone. But that's not necessarily the case. Ozone does cause symptoms in plants, too much ozone. So ozone is produced when components of vehicle emissions, hydrocarbons, nitrogen oxides react with oxygen and sunlight to form ground level ozone in the atmosphere. And typically we'll see high concentrations of ozone when we have frontal systems come through. So we'll have air inversions where a lot of atmospheric ozone is pushed down to the surface, and we'll see symptoms in certain plants. This is just an example of the progression of ozone damage in watermelons. If you look at the top left, that's a healthy leaf, and then gradually as you if you go from the top left to the bottom right, you'll see a progression in ozone injury. And this was well documented by Dr. Holmes at NC State several years ago. something happened. I don't know. I don't know what happened to my screen then. I'm trying to advance the slide and it's doing something strange.
David, try using the arrows there.
Yeah, I just did. I went to the arrow. So these are different symptoms we see with ozone injury. There's a coniferous tree showing the needles have that tip die back on the ends. Potato up in the top right hand corner showing a bronzing effect. These real bright bronze spots on the leaves. Just for kicks, I threw in a cannabis plant down here in the bottom left, where it's showing these light flecks on the leaves. And then we've got two snap bean varieties in the bottom right corner. Some varieties of the same plant are different, have different susceptibilities to ozone injury. So you've got one row that looks green, that has a little bit of injury on it, whereas you have a different variety of snap bean in the foreground there that's showing very severe. And this kind of throws people off because, oh gosh, how come one row of snap beans? It's got to be something else. One row of snap beans looks fine, and I've got another row of snap beans that looks terrible. There's a lot of variability in symptoms and how different plants, even within the same species, react to ground level ozone. Fortunately, some pollutants have decreased over time. You used to hear a lot about acid rain, but since 1980, we don't see as much acid rain because of vehicle emission standards have improved, so we don't see nearly as much acid rain as they did earlier in the 1970s, maybe early 80s. And then everybody's favorite is herbicide phytotoxicity. So herbicides are naturally going to kill plants, right? They're designed to kill weeds that you don't want. Figuring out how your plants that you don't want to die get exposed to herbicides is going to be the trick, because this is kind of like a in-depth investigation. Because a lot of times it's not you didn't apply a herbicide, maybe even your neighbor didn't apply a herbicide. Somebody down the street could have applied a herbicide. If the wind's blowing the right direction, depending on the type of crops that you're planting, you could still see herbicide phytotoxicity. So how do these herbicides get to places where people want to kill weeds and get to your vegetable garden where you don't want to see problems? It can be through drift and or volatilization of herbicides. In some cases, herbicides can be carried through leaching down into the soil or across the surface in soil runoff. In some cases, I've seen it with soil or soil amendment applications, and I'll get into that in a little bit when I show some symptoms of some herbicide phytotoxicity, or just misapplication, applying the wrong herbicide to the wrong plant. You'll get unwanted herbicide phytotoxicity. Typically, what we see with drift is that you'll apply, if you look at this picture of this field, there's a dark green crop grown there on the right, which the herbicide was applied to. And then there's a crop just across the path to the left of it where you're seeing the symptoms. And what you'll see with the drift is that the most severe symptoms will be closest to the area where the herbicide was applied, and they'll gradually decrease on into the field. So this is and a lot of times it's directional. You could tell which way the wind was blowing when the herbicide application was made. So this is one of the things that I look for when I'm thinking about herbicide drift. Another thing that I look at with herbicide drift is the type of injury it causes to leaves. So this is paraquat. This isn't something that you would use in your home garden or you even have access to, or probably shouldn't have access to. But paraquat is a contact herbicide. It kills cells where the drop lands, and it causes the same type of symptom on every plant it touches. So it's indiscriminate on which plants it damages. So you've got these lesions here on this pecan tree, showing the necrotic lesions here on the leaves. And if you look to the right, you see corn. Now, this is interesting because you see the lower leaves of the corn that are affected, but the newer growth up near the top is not. That's because the paraquat drift occurred at a certain point of time, or what I call an event. So you can kind of figure out when the paraquat drift occurred based on the symptoms that occur on the plant. The new growth that came out after the application or after the drift of the paraquat is not affected. So you can kind of it gives you an idea of when that occurred. This is Roundup or glyphosate injury. It always looks pretty much the same. Here it is on the left with a blueberry bush. If you notice those yellowing leaves in the very newest growth, that's very typical of glyphosate injury. If you look to the right, tomato plants have a very distinct symptom of herbicide of Roundup fire toxicity, and in that the portions of the leaf that are closest to the stem are almost bleached in appearance. And it happens in the very newest growth of the tomato plant. And tomatoes are super sensitive to Roundup. You can't go low enough with a dose of Roundup not to get those type symptoms showing up in a tomato plant. This is Phenoxy herbicide drift. These are 2,4-D type herbicides. They cause twisting of leaves and leaf distortion. You see it in a tomato plant here on the left, what Phenoxy herbicide injury will do to those leaves, just really wacky looking curling, funny shaped leaves. On this, the picture on the right is of cotton, where it looks like you almost pulled a leaf and tried and stretched it. It's just very abnormal growth. And this is the type of injury I see also with the soil amendment applications, where if let's say if you're using manure from cows as fertilizer, if those cows fed on grass that have been treated with a Phenoxy herbicide, that herbicide is not broken down in the gut. So if you use the manure from those cows, you will also see Phenoxy herbicide injury show up in your vegetable plants. I've seen that more than one time. So with herbicide drift, I recommend looking at all the plants in the area, especially with paraquat. It's going to speckle up the leaves of the weeds. It's going to show up on all the bushes, all the trees. It's going to look very similar. So I tell people don't just look at tomatoes, look at everything around the tomatoes or the other vegetables to see if you're seeing the same symptoms. That gives you an idea if it's herbicide drift. And the symptom, that's because the symptoms appear similar across multiple species, and it also covers a broad general area. So it's probably not just in your garden, it's probably in your yard or in your shrubs or in a neighboring area as well. And sometimes drift can come from miles away, depending on air currents or the volatilization of herbicides can be carried several miles. So sometimes it's hard to pinpoint where it's coming from. Once again, manure from grazing animals can contaminate and cause Phenoxy herbicide type injuries. That's what we typically see with manure. Soil can sometimes be contaminated, but I urge people to keep an open mind is that when you see it, it's really important to figure out how it got there, and there's a lot of denial around herbicide drift, obviously, because nobody wants to take the blame for spraying something that's going to harm plants. But we've got to get all the answers to be able to figure out how the herbicide drift got there so we can keep it from happening in the future. So now I'm getting to my favorite part, which is actual diseases, because I'm a plant pathologist. I deal with organisms that cause disease. So my definition of a disease is a harmful physiological process caused by a continuous irritation of a plant by a primary causal agent, right? So it obviously has to be harmful. It affects the physiological process of the plant and is caused by continuous irritation, which is really important. I talked about a lot of the herbicide problems being events or ozone problems being an event that happened in a very specific time frame. Pathogens really don't go away. Once they start infecting plants, they hang around for the life of the plant. So it's caused by continuous irritation. It's not an event. And that's why timing of symptoms is so important to understand. So I think of this as kind of a battle with pathogens in your home vegetable garden. So so if you're in a battle, you need to know your enemy, know the things that are going to affect the crops that you're trying to grow. Fungi are the things that cause most of the problems. They're the most diverse and most common. Most of the things that I get into the plant disease clinic are caused by fungi. Bacteria are the second most due to diversity. There's a lot of bacterial pathogens. I don't see as much up here in Virginia as I used to see down in Georgia, but I still see some. Viruses are not much different than human viruses. They really can't move around on their own. They have to be spread by mechanical means or by breathing on people, such as with COVID. But other organisms generally move viruses around, and in the case of plants, it's usually insects that move viruses to the plants that you're trying to grow in the garden. And then we've got nematodes down here on the bottom. These are microscopic roundworms that feed specifically on the roots. They cause roots to be reduced, stunted, or distorted, and they can't pick up water and nutrients like they would if they had a healthy root system. So you'll see you'll see symptoms above ground, but what's causing the problem is actually nematodes below the ground, below the soil surface. Excuse me. This is a picture just giving you a size reference of these different causal agents. Nematode up here at the top, a multicellular organism, is going to be pretty large. Fungal mycelium, if any of you have seen mold, you can actually see with the naked eye a fungus growing. It's hard to see bacteria. Bacteria, you see those en masse. You cannot see individual bacteria. Even with a microscope, you can see individual bacteria, but they're so small you can't identify them using a microscope. And with viruses, they're on the molecular level. You can't even see them with a microscope. You'd have to have an electron microscope to actually be able to make out what a virus would look like. We usually test for bacteria and viruses because we're so small. So we test for those, not much different than if you take a test for strep or if you take a test for COVID or something like that. So we test for those, but we can actually see nematodes and fungi using a microscope. So I like to use the disease triangle. It is very relative to just about any problem you see with the disease. And it involves three main things. The pathogen, you've got to have a pathogen that is infectious to the crop you're trying to grow. Then you've got to have the correct environment. Up until recently, we hadn't had good environmental conditions for disease because it's been very dry. Typically, most of the pathogens that we see are driven by long periods of leaf wetness, rainfall, high relative humidity. And then you've got with your host, your host is susceptible at different growth stages during its life. So or different varieties of the same species can have different levels of susceptibility, and time is an important factor over all of this. Some pathogens are more prevalent during certain times of the year. The time of infection is important. Your diseases that affect early on cause more loss than diseases that affect later in the life of the plant. So time is a big consideration when we think about the disease triangle. So if you're growing certain crops in your garden, I think it behooves you to understand what types of diseases may affect that crop. And you want to be able to identify those diseases. So we use symptoms and signs to be able to identify pathogens. Understand the ecology, what makes them tick, what growth stage do they infect, what environmental conditions are favorable for infection. And then you try to find weak links or vulnerable areas in these pathogens that you can manipulate so you don't have as many problems with them in the crops that you're trying to grow. And you've got to know your host. You got to know what a healthy plant looks like. I know that's a bit intuitive, but in some cases, I've seen people send me pictures of perfectly healthy plants they're not used to seeing. They've never grown this plant before. They really don't know what it's supposed to look like, and they think something's wrong with it, when in actuality, that's how it's supposed to look. Know the optimal water and nutritional requirements for the crops you're trying to grow. Know your optimal plant spacing, how close you plant them together versus the growth habit. Obviously, a crop that's very viney, that grows across the ground, you don't plant those as close together as crops that grow upright. Now, how fast a crop should grow, kind of have an idea of how long it should be before it reaches maturity. Most of the time with vegetables, we think about something reaching maturity when it's producing what we're, the harvested product, like a tomato fruit, corn, ear corn, mature bean pods. And know the periods when the host is susceptible. Know if, I've got certain pathogens that affect juvenile plants versus pathogens that affect plants that are producing fruit. And know your environment. Know the climatic factors that are essential for plant growth. As a plant pathologist, when it's not raining, it's very dry, I feel like the Maytag repairman. It's like I know that there's not a lot of disease pressure out there causing problems. Know the factors that favor disease outbreak. So you've got to know which factors the wet weather makes disease worse, and pay attention to your weather patterns. What about time? The longer a crop is in the field, the more at risk it is. You can compare pumpkins and squash. They're both cucurbita pepo. It's basically the same species of plant, but they grow very differently. Squash, or a short season crop. You plant them, you start picking them in a few weeks' time, and then you're done. Pumpkins may be in the field for several months. So a crop that's in the field for several months is going to be exposed to more diseases, so they're more at risk. The duration of weather patterns are important. So the length of leaf wetness. So if you've got several days of wet, cloudy weather is going to cause more disease problems than a short thunderstorm that comes through in a matter of half an hour, and then it's gone, and then it's dry afterwards. And the timing of infection is important as well. Once again, plants that are infected early are going to show a lot more damage and have a lot more loss associated than plants affected later, when they might actually be producing something you can harvest. Plant pathologists get hung up about what symptoms and signs are. So a symptom is the reaction of the plant to the pathogen, basically. So I say it's analogous to having a fever. So when you've got a fever, you're showing a symptom of something else going wrong. It basically it's something it alerts you that something's not right. And with plants, you see this as wilting, stunning, chlorosis, which is a fancy name for yellowing, or necrosis, which is dead tissue. You'll see spots on the leaves, cankers, galls, all kinds of things. Those are all symptoms. You're not actually seeing the pathogen, you're seeing the plant's reaction to the pathogen. The primary symptom is actually where it's occurring on the plant. So if you see a leaf spot, that's a good primary symptom, because that pathogen is in that lesion on that leaf. A good example of just a symptom is when a root pathogen is attacking the roots, but you only see the symptoms up in the top part of the plant. So that's a symptom. A primary symptom is where the damage is actually occurring. A sign is when you actually see the pathogen, which sometimes is very difficult to do without the aid of a microscope, but I'll show examples of signs that you can see of certain pathogens. But this is basically catching the culprit red-handed. You actually see the organism at work. Sometimes you see mold growing on the plants. Sometimes you can actually see fruiting structures or little areas where the fungus is actually sporulating. Sometimes you'll see bacterial ooze coming out of a plant, or bacterial streaming. There's a lot of ways that you can actually see the signs of the actual organism that's causing a problem. So this is a symptom. You can't see it that well because I've got that part of the clinic form shown, but it's really just a tomato plant that's wilted in between two other tomato plants. This could be caused, if you show me this picture, I can't tell you what's killing the tomato plant, but what I can tell you is where to look. If you see a whole plant going down with healthy neighbors on either side, I'm going to tell you to look down at the base of the plant. In this particular case, this farmer thought he had a bad problem in his tomato field, when in actuality, someone had gone along with pruning shears and actually cut the tomato plant off at the bottom. But it looks just like a disease until you actually go up and look at the base of the plant or look at the root system. This is another wilted tomato plant. This is caused by bacterial wilt. This plant is wilted while still green. It's just another vascular wilt. And I'll show you how you can identify bacterial wilt in just a few slides. And this is tomato spider wilt virus. So I've showed you what could be a fungus or a physical damage in the first tomato picture of the symptom. I showed you another one of bacterial wilt where the plant is intact and wilting. And these plants with the viruses, this is tomato spider wilt virus, and you know, these plants are kind of wilted, but it doesn't look the same as the other wilt. The leaves aren't completely drooped; they're more curled up, and then you've got, but you do have neighbors that look fine. That's very typical of a virus in outbreak in a field. It's kind of hit and miss among plants. And then with squash, with certain viruses, they'll cause distorted or off color squash, like you see here with these. So you would indicate that you see this primarily on the fruit, and that the fruit are discolored or warty in appearance. Very typical virus symptom on squash fruit. This is a good primary symptom of a root or a pathogen that affects the vascular system of a plant. So this is the base of a tomato plant where I've taken a pocket knife and kind of split it open. If you see that brown area in there, we call that vascular discoloration. That's a symptom of the pathogen causing damage to the vascular system. So that's why we call it a primary symptom, because that's where the damage of the pathogen is actually occurring. This is also a primary symptom. This is downy mildew on a pumpkin. So what you see are these tiny yellow flecks on these pumpkin leaves. And if you look on the underside of the leaf, you'll actually see where the organism is growing. But this is a primary symptom. The organism is actually causing a problem where those yellow flecks or lesions are on that leaf. This is a sign. So we've switched from symptoms to signs. This is a sign. This is powdery mildew. You see powdery mildew on your crepe myrtles. You see powdery mildew on your squash. You actually see the fungus that's causing a problem on the leaf. So when you actually see the fungus, that's a sign. And this is your bacterial wilt on tomato that I talked about a little bit earlier. So what you can do is if your tomato plant is wilting and you don't see fungal growth around the base of the plant, if you cut that plant off and put it in a clear glass of water, and I've done this recently with a home gardener, I asked them if they had a clear glass, and we actually pulled up one of their tomato plants and cut it and stuck it in a glass of water, and bacteria start streaming out of the vascular system there. And that's how we diagnose bacterial wilt. We can't see individual bacteria, but we can see them in mass streaming out of that vascular system. This is another sign of a tomato disease. This is a fungus that causes southern blight. It's a white fungus that basically girdles the plant at the base. One of the more common problems that I see on tomatoes in this area. So how do you manage all these problems? I'm going to try to cover this in the last 10 minutes. Prevention is the key. Everything we do in plant pathology is based on prevention. We don't see a problem and react to it and think that we're going to have you can't really react to these things. You know, when we get sick, we take medicine, we get better. Plants don't get better. We can't react to them. There's no real true remedial control. So everything we do is typically, we do everything that we can do before we actually see symptoms or plant disease problems. So most of the plants that you grow in your vegetable garden have a host of pathogens that want to kill them. And I'm going to be honest with you, I have heard it more than once among plant pathologists that say tomato plants are just looking for a reason to die. There's a bunch of stuff, as you've already seen, that can kill tomato plants. They have a large list of pathogens that can cause problems. you've got to think preventively. Most diseases are hard to control once you're well established. Once they're well established, as I've already said, you can't react to them. Everything has to be done before you see symptoms. So recognize what are the most common problems from year to year that you see in your vegetable garden, and you try to focus your efforts to control those most problem diseases. So how do you do this? You pick an area that's well drained. You want to be able to control the moisture. Vegetable growers don't like rain typically. They want to be able to irrigate and control the amount of moisture. Why? Because they know that moisture is a key in getting a lot of plant disease epidemics started. So you want to start in a well-drained soil that you can control the amount of soil moisture. You want to open and sunny areas so plants will dry faster. And you want to stay away from commercial fields for another site, because we've already talked about herbicide drift. If you've got plants that are growing close to a commercial field of soybeans or cotton or corn, the herbicides from those fields might drift over and harm your vegetable garden. Practice crop rotation, probably one of the most used and most effective things that we can do as a home vegetable gardener. Don't grow the same vegetables in the same spot year after year. By rotating to unrelated crops, you break the pathogen cycle. You take away things that pathogens can feed on by growing a crop that they can't feed on for a certain number of years. Grasses and corn, including sweet corn, are good choices because they're not near. They're very far related from any of the broadleaf or the dicot crops that we grow in the garden. So typically grasses and corn are good rotation partners with your tomatoes, potatoes, beans, squash, cucurbits, those type things. So you want to rotate across groups of related crops. So you don't want to rotate within any one of these groups. You want to rotate across a group. So you want to so a poor rotation would be growing cabbage, and then the next time you plant, you grow turnip greens. Or if you grow peppers, and then you turn around and grow eggplant. That's not a good rotation. What you want to grow are cucurbits like in group A, and then rotate the next time with any of the plants in these other groups because they're further related. Plants that are related in each one of these groups also have pathogens that feed on them. So the pathogens that affect watermelons can also affect pumpkins. Pathogens that affect beans can also affect southern peas, and so on. So you want to rotate across these groups of related crops. Some more management basics. You want to use have good soil conditions. Your soil pH can influence some diseases. You can make sure that your nutrient status and your pH is good, and add nutrients only as dictated by your soil test. Don't overfeed, especially nitrogen. If you apply too much nitrogen, you can get excessive rank plant growth. And what that does, it makes the tissues are more succulent. They're softer, more succulent tissues that pathogens can infect and colonize better. And they also get big, and they shade the areas that you're growing in. And if they create that shade, that's a microclimate that promotes certain plant diseases. So the plants get too big and they taste too good if they're over fertilized. Taste too good for pathogens, that is. Look for resistant varieties. This is one of my favorite, if not my favorite tactic, because all you do is you pick a variety that doesn't get the pathogen that you're having problems with and plant it, and you almost eliminate that problem simply by planting a resistant variety. And it can eliminate the need for fungicides or some of these other plant pathogen management products. So with tomatoes, look for nematode resistance, fusarium resistance, early and late blight resistance, tomato spotted wilt virus resistance. Each one of these crops have got different pathogens that they're resistant to. So whatever problem you're seeing the most, you want to pick a variety that has resistance to the problems that you're seeing more often in your vegetable garden. And you can see the difference in this pumpkin down here at the bottom. You've got a powdery mildew resistant pumpkin here on the left, and a powdery mildew susceptible pumpkin here on the right, grown at the same time. One is more susceptible than the other. Choose the resistant variety. Some common problems we see on tomato, alternaria or early blight, very characteristic. When you see alternaria on leaves, they're typically very round lesions. And I like this lesion right here to look at because you can almost make out that concentric ring pattern within that lesion. That target or concentric ring pattern is very typical of an alternaria lesion on a tomato and any other crop that has an alternaria pathogen. This is tomato spotted wilt on tomatoes, gives you a lot of different looks. You already saw the picture at the top right showing the stunted plants. If you look at some leaves that have, from plants that have spotted wilt, you'll see these little bronze lesions down here on the base of the leaf. And then in some cases, you'll see fruit that have tomato spotted wilt virus symptoms. These fruit are typically not as edible as normal fruit. They're typically very mealy and pithy. And they're just not good to eat. They're typically very hard. This is downy mildew on cucumber, probably one of the most prevalent diseases you'll see on cucumber. I showed a picture of this on pumpkin. You get these tiny lesions that start out. You'll see them on the top side. With cucumber, they're almost angular in shape because it's a vein restricted pathogen. In the morning when it's still moist, you can turn those leaves over and you'll see these little dark patches on that circle picture. Those dark patch, if you look real close with, say if you got a hand lens or something, you can actually see the little dark fuzz coming off of those, and that's actually the growth of the pathogen from downy mildew. There's a lot of downy mildew in Virginia right now on cucumbers. So this is just more information on about resistant varieties with tomatoes. You've got several tomato varieties are resistant to tomato spotted wilt virus and root knot nematode. I highly recommend those. Most tomato varieties have some resistance to early blight. We don't see as many problems with early blight as we used to, but a lot of heirloom varieties don't have any resistance to early blight. And you're going to see more problems with that disease on them. With late blight, we don't see as much late blight out. This is an example of a disease that I would not necessarily target for a resistant variety, but just because we don't see as much late blight in Virginia. And just some examples of different varieties and the resistances you have in cucumbers, bacterial spot, and peppers and pumpkins. So there's just a lot of variety resistance out there if you know where to look. Sanitation, as you imagine, is important. Use pathogen-free seed and transplants. If you see problems in store-bought plants, reject those that have diseases. Don't save seed if possible. I've got some information on that. I'm gonna move on to the next slide. This is bacterial spot of tomatoes. Usually it's brought in on infected seed. How do you prevent that? If you're saving seed, is you use hot water seed treatment. So hot water seed treatment in very small seeded crops, you can kill the pathogens with the hot water seed treatment. The soaking time and temperature is very important. And there's a list here that you can look at, and these are available on the internet, that gives you the water temperature and the soaking time for seed from each one of these crops to not just kill bacterial spot, but other pathogens if on seeds you're planning to use. I'm gonna skip a little bit over this. You can look up information on hot water seed treatment. There's some other things like bleach or trisodium phosphate that you can use to disinfest seeds. But I think starting out with clean plants and clean seeds is a good way to reduce a lot of the pathogens. Once again, we're in prevention mode, not in reaction mode. This is just another picture of southern blight here on tomatoes. If you look at the right-hand picture, typically southern blight looks like you took a wet white chicken feather and laid it across a stem, and it oppresses to the stem. And in some cases, you'll see these little circular bodies, little white balls that later turn tan. These are little sclerotia or fungal seed that last in the soil for several years, very characteristic of that particular disease. So how do you manage that? You can maintain your soil pH levels. Southern blight is worse in acidic soils. Plant early to avoid warm temperatures. Southern blight is a high temperature disease. It's worse in July and August because of the high temperatures. You can bury the disease by plowing. Burying those sclerotial deprives them oxygen. They've got to have oxygen to be able to infect the plant close to the soil surface. Remove or rogue disease plants from the field. That's another way of getting that disease out of your crop area, and you won't have as much disease in upcoming years. And I'm gonna kind of skip through these. I'm running kind of over on time. Sometimes if you plant early in cool soils, you'll see more damping off problems. So juvenile plants in a cool soil will stay in that juvenile stage longer because it is cool. And so damping off pathogens like Pythium and Rhizoctonia will attack plants like you see in these beans down in the bottom left. Sometimes late planting, you'll get more problems with viral diseases or organisms like your southern blight or insect vectored viruses that are more prevalent during the warmer time of the year. And I think I think I've kind of gone over time. I was just going to skip through here. Irrigate. If you're going to irrigate, I recommend irrigating overhead early in the morning, because the plants will dry off as if they had a heavy dew. So you're not really adding anything to the leaf wetness. And I highly recommend using drip tape and soaker hose so that you can keep leaves from getting wet and reduce the amount of time, the duration period of leaf wetness, which is conducive for pathogens. So I think, unless anybody wants to, I had a little more, too many slides. I will say here at the very final slide, and the reason this is the final slide is that spraying a fungicide or bactericide is the last ditch effort. So, and I know a lot of people don't like to spray, but even if you do spray, you've got to spray before you see disease, before diseases have a chance to get going. Typically, we follow a schedule. Normal weather, whatever normal is a 7 to 10 day interval with fungicide applications. If it's dry, you don't spray as often. Sometimes if it's wet, you might spray more often. And you've got to follow the manufacturer's guidelines. You read the label on those to make sure, not only for your safety, but for the safety of the crop that you're trying to grow, to get the best use out of those products if you choose to use them. And with that, I think I'm going to finish up. I've gone a little bit over, and I'll attempt to answer questions that the group may have. I'm going to stop sharing.
Candy, you got these questions?
Yeah, David, what's the best practice with raised beds and disease abatement?
I have people with raised beds that don't like to rotate. And that's the biggest problem I see. So if you can figure out a way, if you need to grow different crops in those raised beds every year. So I think rotation is going to be real important in a raised bed culture. I've had more than one. I had a guy come and was telling me about his raised beds, and he had a lot of nematode problems. And I told him, I said, the best thing for you to do is either just don't plant those beds some summers and let the nematode populations dwindle, or grow a grass crop, or grow your sweet corn in a raised bed so that nematodes won't have any. You're still producing something, but you're not providing food source for those nematodes.
What's the best thing if you've had a lot of disease, especially blight in your garden, what's the best way to approach that?
Best way to approach is to find out what's causing the blight. If you say blight to me, that could cover a whole gamut of things. So I think that identifying exactly what's causing the blight. The blight is a symptom. So I think the first thing to do is identify what's causing the blight. In general, I think it's best to, if you're overhead irrigating, irrigate early in the morning. That's probably the best way, one of the best ways I see to avoid disease. Rotate the the plants that you're growing every year in different areas in your garden. I think mulching is important, using compost that improves your organic matter in the soil, and it also increases your water holding capacity. and trying to irrigate on a very regular schedule using a drip tape or a soaker hose. Don't let them get too wilty. Don't let them get too, too water stressed. I think a good even schedule, maybe even use a timer on your irrigation will help a whole lot.
Is it helpful if you use a mulch? Will that keep the disease from coming up from the ground?
It does. It creates a barrier. And I had a whole slide on that and I kind of skipped over it because of time. But mulches, what they do is they disperse rain droplets. So big rain droplets, when they hit a hard, flat surface, they splash. A lot of times the pathogens will splash up on the bottom of the leaves, and then the pathogen has a foothold and it'll move up. If you use a mulch, it keeps that from happening. So I think mulches are good from keeping pathogens from getting up on the aerial parts of the plant. Yes.
Should I have let my yellow squash run throughout my raised bed?
Yeah, I think that's not a huge problem. The newest growth on yellow squash is typically not very susceptible. The older leaves are the ones that typically start showing symptoms and signs of pathogens first. So I think it's fine to let them run. And it's not a good idea to prune squash. You can turn the vines back. And the only reason that we typically turn vines back in agriculture is so we don't run over the vines with equipment. But if you turn those vines back, you'll create a very dense canopy, and that's not good for disease.
How long can Cerulean persist in the soil?
What I'm not sure what you're saying there. What was the word you used?
Fusarium?
I'm not sure what that is.
Fusarium.
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 It can persist in the soil for several years. There's some Fusaria that can persist in the soil for 10 or more years, depending on which one it is. They produce these resting stage spores that can last in the soil for a long time until the right host comes along, and then they'll germinate and infect that host. Very difficult to work with Fusarium pathogens as far as rotation.
And that's actually all of our questions. We thank you very much.
All righty. I'm sorry I kind of sped through the last part of it. But anyway, and plus if we have a clinic there in Suffolk, your county agent can send us plant samples so we can figure out what's causing your problems. We have a lot of people walk plant samples in. It's like a walk-in clinic. I had somebody bring me plants today to look at. So we're accessible through your extension agent, or if you happen to be in the area and you want to drop off some plants, you're welcome to do so. But we're going to make you fill out that clinic form so we can get as much information as possible.
David, that was an excellent presentation. I think everybody enjoyed it, and we are grateful that you could join us this evening. For the rest of the group, please join us on September 17th from 1 to 3 for a live workshop on propagation of perennials, and Stacy McGraw is going to do that. Registration is required for this. There's no cost, but registration is required for this in-person workshop, and you can register in Eventbrite by clicking onto the Virginia Beach Master Gardener website, and there's a link to Eventbrite. So you could please join us. There's a limit of 20 people, so get on there quickly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. David, thank you again so very much.
All right. Y'all have a good evening. Thank you.
All right. Just a reminder to everybody, please fill out your evaluation.